a Soviet military hospital where a gruesome double murder took place, a California reform school built on systematic violence, and a Japanese mining island used as a forced labor prison camp. This video covers 3 places of absolute horror that have been transformed into modern tourist attractions. Number 1. Beelitz Sanatorium. The Beelitz Sanatorium is located not far from Berlin, Germany. Its history spans over 100 years, passing through the hands of multiple military factions and serving as the backdrop for a gruesome double murder. In 1898, the Berlin Workers' Health Insurance Corporation purchased 140 hectares of forested land in Beelitz. There, they constructed a self-sufficient 600-bed sanatorium to isolate and treat cases of tuberculosis. The complex ran like a self-contained mini-city, completely off the grid with its own power station, bakery, butcher shop, and post office. Later, during World War I, the German Red Cross transformed the complex into a military field hospital. From October 9th to early December 1916, a young Imperial German Army Lance Corporal named Adolf Hitler stayed here while recuperating from a thigh injury sustained at the Battle of the Somme. From 1933 until 1945, while Germany was under Nazi rule, the specific room where Hitler recovered was turned into a nationalistic propaganda shrine. During World War II, the complex, which by then contained 60 separate buildings, was fully utilized as a German military garrison hospital. In 1945, during the fall of Berlin, the Soviet Red Army seized the entire complex. They turned it into the single largest Soviet military hospital outside the USSR itself. It remained an active, restricted military installation throughout the decades that Germany was divided, and even stayed operational immediately after the reunification of East and West Germany. From December 1990 until March 1991, the deposed dictator of East Germany, Erich Honecker, was granted political asylum by the Soviet military and hidden inside a secure ward at the Beelitz Hospital to evade arrest by unified German prosecutors. Soviet forces secretly flew him out of Beelitz to Moscow on March 13, 1991. The Beelitz Sanatorium bore witness to many pivotal moments of German history, but it also harbors a much darker legacy. From 1989 until 1991, Beelitz Heilstätten and its surrounding towns were haunted by a serial killer. Because his offenses occurred close to or directly within the region, the German tabloid press ultimately dubbed him the Beast of Beelitz. The killer carried out a brutal campaign of violence consisting of 10 confirmed attacks, 6 murders, and 4 assaults where the victims survived. 9 of his 10 offenses occurred entirely outside the hospital gates, scattered across the landfills, forests, and residential homes of the surrounding Brandenburg region, where he targeted women to fulfill a severe fetish for lingerie. He bludgeoned his first fatal victim with a hammer when she caught him stealing underwear from her home. His only strike inside the active Soviet military base took place on March 23, 1991, when he breached the facility's perimeter. His victim, Tamara Petrovskaya, was the wife of a high-ranking Soviet military doctor stationed at the facility. Because she lived in the residential staff housing on the property, she assumed she was safe and walked her infant son into a blind spot, a patch of dense, unpatrolled woods near the edge of the property line where the killer lay in wait. He murdered them both right there in the brush. At this point, you may be wondering how it was possible for a serial killer to go undetected for so long in and around a heavily armed Soviet military base, especially one holding a high-value political asset like Erich Honecker. The killer pulled it off because the sprawling 140-hectare property was divided by dense patches of dark pine forest. Armed Soviet guards were concentrated heavily at the outer checkpoints and inside the primary medical wards. They simply did not have the manpower to patrol the unlit, forested trails connecting the distant pavilions. Furthermore, because the killer grew up in the area, he knew Beelitz and the surrounding forests and towns intimately. What further complicated the investigation was that the crimes took place during the chaotic, bureaucratic transition of German reunification. The local German police had no legal authority to enter or investigate crimes inside an active Soviet military zone. Conversely, the Soviet military police cared primarily about internal security and shielding Honecker. They did not cooperate or share intelligence with German detectives, creating a massive jurisdictional black hole that allowed the killer to slip away. The perpetrator's reign of terror finally ceased after April 5, 1991. On the exact same day he committed his final home invasion murder, he stabbed two 12-year-old girls on an isolated forest path. The children fought back fiercely and escaped. When they spoke to detectives, the girls described a remarkably tall, broad-shouldered man. This description ultimately led to his downfall. On August 1, 1991, two local joggers noticed women's underwear hanging from the trees above a makeshift tent in a forest near Shmerska. As they approached, they witnessed a massive male figure publicly masturbating while wearing a women's bra stretched over his clothes. They alerted the police, who swarmed the woods and made the arrest. His imposing physical appearance, combined with his extreme lingerie fetishes, earned him his second notorious nickname, the Pink Giant. The man was identified as Wolfgang Schmidt, a 6'3" local resident. On December 1, 1992, the Potsdam District Court found Schmidt guilty of 6 murders and multiple attempted murders. Forensic psychiatrists diagnosed him with severe sadistic and transvestite fetishes. The judge handed down a 15-year prison sentence, the absolute maximum allowed under German law at the time, to be followed by indefinite involuntary commitment to a high-security forensic psychiatric hospital. Behind bars at Brandenburg-Gürden prison, Schmidt underwent a total identity transition. By 1997, prison administrators permitted him to wear women's clothing and cosmetics, and he filled his cell with pink accessories and stuffed animals. In 2001, a German court formally approved a legal name change under the Transsexuals Act, permanently changing his legal identity to Beta Schmidt. After the initial 15-year prison term concluded, Beta Schmidt was transferred to a high-security forensic psychiatric clinic in Brandenburg an der Havel, where she remains confined to this day, categorized as far too dangerous for public release. As for the Beelitz Sanatorium, following the total collapse of the Soviet Union, the Russian military permanently withdrew all personnel and handed the keys back to the German government. The complex stood abandoned for decades until 2015, when a commercial tourist attraction was constructed directly over the ruins. Today, an elevated steel canopy walkway allows paying visitors to walk high above the treetops and look down onto the decaying hospital structures. The property is heavily secured, and the interiors of the historic structures are entirely sealed off. However, tourists can book separate guided ground tours to legally step inside the historic buildings and explore the haunting remains of the past. Number 2. Preston Castle. Preston Castle, also known as the Preston School of Industry, is a massive 4-story Romanesque brick castle, complete with towers, parapets, and a stark red facade, located in Ione, California. It opened in 1894 as a juvenile reformatory. The state's original intent was progressive rehabilitation, aiming to reform troubled youth by teaching them practical trades like printing, shoemaking, tailoring, and farming. But from 1900 onward, the school transformed from a place of rehabilitation into a site of systemic physical abuse. Administrators and guards enforced strict discipline through severe physical punishment and psychological isolation. The primary instrument of punishment was the paddle, a heavy, thick leather strap soaked in water to inflict as much pain as possible without fracturing bones. Guards dragged misbehaving boys into a soundproofed basement room, strapped them down, and beat them. For severe infractions, such as an attempted escape, the staff subjected the boys to extreme solitary confinement. They were locked inside the cage, a cramped 6 by 9 foot iron cell. Inmates remained there for weeks on end, stripped of clothing and given a restricted diet consisting of only bread and water. From 1894 until 1960, at least 17 young inmates died on the property. The causes of death included yellow fever, tuberculosis, industrial accidents in the workshops, and shootings by guards during escape attempts. Staff buried the deceased boys in a nearby hillside cemetery in unmarked graves, identifying them only by numbers in an official ledger. These brutal methods of correcting the youth did quite the opposite. In some cases, the incarcerated boys left the Preston School in worse shape than they arrived. Such was the case of Carol Chessman, possibly Preston's most infamous inmate, who arrived at the school in 1937. At 16 years old, following a string of auto thefts in Southern California, Chessman was sent to the Preston School of Industry. He was subjected to the facility's strict, military-style cadet system, performing forced agricultural labor on the school's farmland. He was paroled in 1938, but was caught stealing another car just 1 month later, resulting in the state returning him to the castle for a second, harsher term. 9 years after leaving Preston, Chessman was arrested as the notorious Red Light Bandit, a predator who used a stolen car equipped with a red spotlight to ambush, rob, and assault couples in Los Angeles lovers' lanes. Convicted on 17 counts, Chessman was sentenced to death under California's strict kidnapping laws, despite never killing anyone. He spent 12 years on San Quentin's death row, where, in addition to having legal counsel, he acted as his own lawyer and successfully stalled 8 separate execution dates by utilizing legal loopholes. On May 2, 1960, the 9th execution date arrived, and Chessman was strapped into Chair B inside the San Quentin gas chamber. The time of the execution was set for 10 a.m. At that exact moment, Chessman's lawyers frantically pleaded with federal judge Louis Goodman for a 9th stay of execution based on a newly filed petition. Judge Goodman agreed to grant the stay and instructed his secretary to call the execution chamber immediately. The secretary placed the call at 10 a.m., but mistakenly dialed the wrong extension number for the San Quentin switchboard. This mistake delayed the connection by less than 60 seconds, but it was too late. By the time the call successfully went through to the warden at 10:01 a.m., the executioner had already dropped the cyanide pellets into the sulfuric acid beneath Chessman's chair. Under California state law, an execution could not be halted or reversed once the deadly gas began filling the chamber. Chessman was pronounced dead at 10:12 a.m. at the age of 38. Chessman's case caught massive public attention. Not only was he the first prisoner in the United States to be sentenced to death without ever committing a homicide, but during his time on death row, he also became a best-selling author. In his 1954 autobiography, Cell 2455, Death Row, which he wrote entirely from prison, Chessman explicitly detailed his time at Preston Castle. He stated that the brutal environment, the beatings with the leather paddle, and the institutional violence completely stripped away his fear of authority. His time at Preston paved the way for his transition into a violent career criminal. But it wasn't only the inmates who went through hell at the Preston School. On February 23, 1950, Anna Corbin, a 50-year-old local widow and the head housekeeper of the facility, arrived for her morning shift at the castle. Around mid-morning, Corbin walked down into the basement of the main administration building to count and organize the facility's linen supplies. When she failed to return for lunch, the staff launched a search of the building. Co-workers navigated the subterranean corridors and noticed a dark trail of blood on the concrete floor. The trail led them to a deep, secluded storage closet where they discovered Corbin's body stuffed inside a heavy canvas laundry bag. The medical examiner determined that the killer had brutally bludgeoned Corbin over the head with a blunt instrument, believed to be a heavy iron pipe. The attacker also fractured her skull and strangled her to death before concealing the body. Law enforcement immediately focused their investigation on the inmates and staff who had access to the locked basement keys. Investigators arrested Eugene Monroe, an 18-year-old black inmate who worked on the janitorial crew and possessed access to the basement. Monroe had a prior history of violence, and investigators discovered traces of blood on his clothing. The state put Monroe on trial for first-degree murder 2 separate times between 1950 and 1951. But both trials resulted in a hung jury. The defense successfully argued that the school administration completely contaminated the crime scene before forensics arrived, making the physical evidence unreliable. Monroe was released from custody regarding the homicide, and to this day, Anna Corbin's brutal murder remains unsolved. In 1960, state inspectors declared the massive brick Preston Castle to be structurally unsafe and a severe fire hazard. The California Department of Corrections abandoned the main castle building, moving all remaining operations into newer, modern concrete facilities constructed on the surrounding grounds. The castle sat completely abandoned to the elements for nearly 4 decades, until the Preston Castle Foundation secured a long-term lease from the state to board up the structure and halt further decay. Today, it serves as a dark tourism attraction, where paying visitors can tour the imposing, hollowed-out corridors where hundreds of boys were broken by the state, and stand in the very basement where Anna Corbin took her final breath. Number 3. Hashima Island. Hashima Island is located roughly 15 kilometers off the coast of Nagasaki, Japan. It is a 16-acre rock, about the size of 9 soccer fields. In 1890, the Mitsubishi Corporation purchased the island to fully exploit its rich undersea coal deposits. As the workforce grew over the years, and the island was repeatedly battered by Pacific typhoons, Mitsubishi constructed Building Number 30, Japan's very first large-scale concrete high-rise apartment block. Over the following decades, Hashima Island was entirely encased in concrete and crowded with dozens of high-rises, schools, and a hospital. Viewed from the ocean, its silhouette looked exactly like a massive military vessel, earning it the permanent nickname Gunkanjima, meaning Battleship Island. But it was during the era of World War II that the island earned its second, darker nickname, Hell Island. As Japan mobilized for the war, the Japanese government and Mitsubishi utilized state mobilization laws to conscript thousands of wartime laborers, including colonial Korean civilians and Chinese prisoners of war. They effectively transformed this industrial island into a de facto forced labor prison camp. Mining operations ran 24 hours a day on rotating 12-hour shifts. The mining shafts plunged up to 1,000 meters beneath sea level, directly under the ocean floor, where temperatures regularly exceeded 45 degrees Celsius with nearly 100% humidity. Because the heat was so unbearable and gas explosions were a constant threat, conscripts were forced to work completely naked, except for a loincloth, a helmet, and a cap lamp. The coal seams were often less than 3 feet high, forcing conscripts to lie flat on their stomachs or sides for 12 hours straight in highly toxic, coal dust-choked air. Mitsubishi guards, ironically called safety supervisors, stood over the workers with wooden clubs, administering immediate physical beatings to any laborer who slowed down due to heat stroke or exhaustion. While Japanese residents had access to standard food rations, Korean and Chinese laborers were fed a substandard slurry made of crushed, dried soybean oil cake waste, mixed with a tiny amount of low-grade brown rice. This near-zero protein diet caused massive outbreaks of emaciation, diarrhea, and beriberi, a severe vitamin B1 deficiency that leads to heart failure. Escaping the island was virtually impossible due to the 15-kilometer stretch of rough, open ocean currents separating it from the mainland. Desperate conscripts who tried to swim away using empty oil cans as flotation devices almost always drowned. The few who did make it to nearby land were quickly captured, returned to Hashima, and publicly tortured. When workers died of accidents or starvation, Mitsubishi shipped the corpses to Nakanoshima, a tiny, uninhabited rocky outcrop less than a kilometer away that served as the designated crematory to burn the dead forced laborers. On August 9, 1945, at 11:02 a.m., the atomic bomb Fat Man detonated directly over Nagasaki. Because of its physical distance from the mainland, Hashima Island did not catch fire, and the concrete buildings did not collapse. However, the concussive shockwave was so massive that it blew out almost every single glass window on the island simultaneously. But the real horror for the prisoners came after the blast. Even though the power grid had failed and the windows were shattered, Mitsubishi forced the miners to keep working. In the days following the atomic explosion, the Japanese military and Mitsubishi selected a massive contingent of the Korean and Chinese forced laborers and shipped them directly into the smoldering, highly radioactive ruins of Ground Zero Nagasaki. These completely unprotected prisoners were forced to perform manual clearing operations, shoveling debris, searching for survivors, and carrying radioactive steel and rubble. As a result, many of Hashima's wartime slaves survived the brutal mines only to be poisoned by the nuclear fallout, suffering agonizing illnesses and deaths in the weeks that followed. Once World War II ended, the prison camp was finally dismantled. The surviving Korean and Chinese conscripts, many of whom had been forced into the radioactive ruins of Nagasaki to clear the post-bomb debris, were liberated and repatriated home. By October 1945, Hashima was a silent, near-empty concrete ghost town. This was the end of the wartime horrors of Hashima Island, but it was not the end of its story. As the late 1940s rolled into the 1950s, a shattered Japan began its miraculous post-war economic recovery, a resurrection that required massive amounts of energy. The veins of coal running directly underneath the ocean floor at Hashima were some of the highest-grade energy sources on Earth. Mitsubishi couldn't afford to let the island rot. Mining operations had to resume. To lure voluntary Japanese miners and their families out to a barren rock in the ocean, Mitsubishi turned Hashima into a high-earning, modern paradise. They offered completely free rent, free electricity, free water, and salaries that were far higher than anything on the mainland. At a time when most of Japan was still struggling to rebuild, nearly 100% of Hashima households owned a television, a washing machine, and a refrigerator, the ultimate luxury symbols of the era. Because the perks of working at Hashima were so attractive, thousands of families flooded the island. But with a physical size of only 9 soccer fields, the only way to expand the community was to build skyward. Over the coming years, Hashima Island transformed into a vertical concrete beehive, where apartment roofs were converted into school playgrounds and vegetable gardens. A fully functioning hospital, a cinema, a town square, and several bars were all crammed inside a labyrinth of interconnected concrete high-rises. By 1959, Hashima reached its absolute peak population of 5,259 residents, officially becoming the most densely populated place on Earth at that time. In January 1974, as petroleum completely replaced coal as Japan's primary energy source, Mitsubishi officially closed the undersea mines down forever. In April of that year, the final residents packed their belongings and evacuated the island. Mitsubishi completely locked down the facility, leaving the concrete high-rises abandoned to the ocean spray. After 35 years of being strictly off-limits to the public, the city of Nagasaki officially opened a small, highly monitored section of Hashima to commercial tourism in April 2009. In July 2015, UNESCO formally designated Hashima Island as a World Heritage Site under the umbrella of Sites of Japan's Meiji Industrial Revolution. Today, the island is heavily restricted, and individual landings or private boats are completely illegal. However, it is possible to visit Hashima by booking an official commercial cruise. Because of severe structural instability and collapse risks, tourists are forbidden from stepping foot inside the historic concrete buildings or the residential quarters of the forced laborers. Instead, they are kept strictly on a custom-built, elevated concrete walkway that wraps around 3 specific viewing platforms on the safe edge of the island.